Previously, in my series Back to Basics 2.0, I pointed out that the most significant problem for K-12 is rampant disengagement in the forms of students who drop out, underachieve, and faux-achieve, which is jumping through the hoops without mastering the material. The majority of teachers are also disengaged. As a result, learning in K-12 is mostly shallow, and the all-important deeper learning that we need is disappointingly rare. The main point was that deeper learning is dependent on support for primary human needs. When those primary needs are supported, you get more joy, and that brings out more genius. Which is why I call my book More Joy, More Genius. That epidemic of disengagement is caused by a lack of support for primary human needs of students and teachers. In this video, I will explain one of the primary reasons why that is the case. There are three moral ideologies about schooling that interact with each other. Problems arise because of how the ideologies contradict each other. Most of the time, when one of those ideologies becomes dominant in someone's mind, they block out the other ideologies. If that someone is a policymaker, they will be likely to enact policies that negate the practices that follow from the other ideologies. Currently, the dominant ideology is based on the assumption that schools must be held accountable to strict standards by testing and grading every student frequently throughout their schooling. The state is assumed to be obligated to set high standards for each individual student and use test scores to hold schools accountable for wise use of taxpayer funds. We all have intuitions that make this argument seem compelling, and it is a growing global ideology. In 2006, national tests were administered in over half the world's developing countries and 75% of the already developed countries. One test or another was being used for accountability by over half the countries participating in the 2009 PISA test. And accountability was reportedly growing through international policy pressure. Ensuring that our collective investment in schools is producing good returns would be a good idea if producing an education were as simple as manufacturing a pencil. Measuring how many pencils pop out of a pencil-making machine is not the same as measuring how much mathematics children know and understand. For over 100 years, mainstream schools have been criticized for being inhumane industrial factories where children are treated like machine fodder. The most popular moral criticism of the mainstream is that even if you produced a precisely measured positive outcome, it is fundamentally wrong to treat any human being as a raw material for industrial machinery. Teachers in the school system should be making those children read, write, and do arithmetic in humane ways. Schools should not be factory-like anonymous bureaucracies that destroy individual uniqueness and ignore the cultural context that nurtures students and their families. Human society should not emulate the evil Borg from Star Trek. The most influential champions of this perspective maintain that education will only truly happen when schools embody the highest ideals of social justice and equity. Critics taking a third perspective assert that humane jail? Still a jail. And schools should not be jails. The Washington Post quoted a 2017 graduate who said that his high school was more like state prison. From this critical point of view, even if you place those academic constraints on children in some humane way, it is evil to do it against their will. This view is less common, but it has been around since at least the 1920s, when A.S. Neal founded the famous Summerhill School in England. Boston College psychology professor Peter Gray is a leading proponent of this view today. He wrote, "Our schools fail because they're based on the false premise that education is something that is done to young people by professionals, not something that young people do for themselves. So the three sacred cows in education are accountability to testing and standards, social justice and equity, and freedom and democracy. And if your behavior was dictated by faraway bureaucrats, you too would probably feel like a prisoner or cog 3 of 9 in the Borg machine, or both. The fact that each camp takes their perspective to be a moral imperative means that these are not just trivial differences of opinion. They are fundamental disagreements about how society should be helping citizens to create good lives. Fortunately, we can look to other disagreements that have some similar characteristics to get a handle on how to resolve this problem. By taking a quick look at two scientific debates, we take the moral consequences down a notch. The first debate is whether light is a wave or a particle. This is a debate that can be traced back to the ancient Greeks. We focus on the double slit experiment that settled the issue. So, the setup is that you have a wall where a pattern will be observed. Some distance in front of that wall, you also have a screen with a pair of parallel slits in it. Finally, you have a means of shooting waves and stuff at the screen. The experiment is based on the observation that when you randomly throw objects, say marbles, at the screen, then some of them pass through the slits and cause a pattern of just two stripes to appear on the wall. However, when instead of discrete objects, you send waves through, then the pattern on the wall is a series of bands called an interference pattern. When you do the experiment with photons of light going through double vertical slits, then an interference pattern of vertical bands shows up, which suggests that light is a wave. When this experiment was first done in the 1800s, the particle theory was associated with bigwig scientists like Sir Isaac Newton, and it had a lot more believers than the wave theory, so experimental variations were concocted to save the particle theory. The particle theory fans didn't like the mathematical implications. The math suggested the possibility of a single photon going through both slits simultaneously, which is obviously crazy talk. So they added a method of observing the photon at the slit so they could prove it went through one or the other, not both simultaneously. And when they did that, the pattern on the wall was just two vertical bands, not a spread of bands across the wall. The additional observation changed the result of the experiment, which is not supposed to happen. It is weird, but it is the kind of weird that everyone sees every time they do the experiment. So the conclusion was that both sides were right. Light is both a wave and a particle, depending on how it is observed. Werner Heisenberg, the famous quantum physicist, wrote, "The measuring device has been constructed by the observer, and we have to remember that what we observe is not nature in itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning." Another scientific debate that also has roots going back to the Greeks is what causes our behavior. Is our behavior caused by the genes inside us, nature, or the environment outside us, nurture? Do we do what we do because of inherited traits that are transmitted by genes, or do we do it because of the experiences we have had and how we have learned from them? Epigenetics refers to the discovery that settled the question. What epigenetics revealed was that experiences with environmental conditions can cause certain genes to turn on or off like a switch. Genes switching on and off, not a big deal. The weird thing that no one thought was possible was finding out that not only the gene, but also a change in the position of your gene switch can get passed down to your children and grandchildren. Thanks to the discovery of epigenetics, another scientific debate turned out to be resolved by accepting a previously inconceivable both-and proposition rather than what we assumed would be either-or. Our behavior is caused by both our genes and the environment, both nature and nurture. The point being that sometimes we need to drop the contradiction between different ideas about reality. The logic of contradiction itself is sometimes wrong. If you are curious about these scientific debates, there are links to more information in the description on YouTube and at dladvocates.org. Here's a cartoon that illustrates how science arrives at these truths about unseen aspects of reality. There are 6 blind men, and they are each asked to describe what an elephant is like. Since they each have access only to their own small portion of the elephant, they each describe it differently. But we know from the privileged perspective chosen by the artist that they are all describing a reality that transcends the limitations of their individual observations and descriptions. The truth is at the center of this Venn diagram. Each description is valid, but the whole only makes sense when they are combined at the center of the diagram. For a deeper look at this idea, we'll focus on a simpler object. Consider this shape. What if it is the shadow of something hidden? When you know that you are seeing a shadow, then you should consider the possibility that the object casting it could be more than a mere circle, for instance, a sphere. But the next guy sees it casting a square shadow and figures it's a cube. Then our third observer sees it casting a triangular shadow and says it's a pyramid. Let's remember that there's one reality we are charged with describing, but its true nature is hidden from us. What is this object that can project all three of these different shadows? What object resides at the center of this Venn diagram? Our observers came up with plausible explanations for their observations, but when we know that the reality must encompass all valid descriptions, then we can conclude that those solutions must be unrealistic ideas to the degree that they are incompatible with each other. If we were just talking about an ordinary object, then this would be trivial. In K-12, we are talking about the reality of how children learn. When children are involved, the moral stakes are substantially higher, and each opinion can become a sacred cow. Remember those sacred cows I mentioned earlier? The dominant mainstream ideology that is growing globally is accountability to standards and testing. Remember that what is alarming about each is how it excludes the policies and practices of the others. Next, we have social justice and equity. This view is fairly common, and at least here in North America is widely recognized. And the third is the ideology of freedom and democracy, which is a long-standing view, even though it is not a common one in K-12. So here we have the sacred cows that we recognize are not going to be adequate for managing the reality of K-12 as long as they're implemented through policies and practices that are mutually exclusive. The challenge now is how to milk these sacred cows by separating out the bits that interfere with the truths that the other views are trying to protect. The task is to preserve the essential truth that reflects the underlying reality. Each ideology has a core truth that informs their policies and practices, even if the proponents don't realize it or have lost track of it. Let's zoom in to the heart of the literal object before we deal with the metaphorical one. Here's the object that can simultaneously cast square, triangular, and circular shadows. Those three seemingly distinct descriptions were all pointing to the true nature of this object. Now we turn to the challenge of discerning the essential truths that lie buried in the ideologies of K-12. To meet that challenge, we take a brief detour back to Basics 2.0, supporting human needs. In particular, the three psychological needs that most people are not familiar with. Let's draw them out one at a time. First, the social justice ideology is built on the core truth of the need for relatedness. Next, the ideology of accountability is built on the core truth of the need for competence. Finally, the ideology of freedom is based on the core truth of the need for autonomy. As revealed by the science of psychology, these needs are the very foundations of how humans learn deeply. When the three aspects are put together, then what should we call it? In my book, More Joy, More Genius, I call it nurturing. We can create the conditions in K-12 schools for deeper learning and overcome the disengagement problem when we create policies and practices that recognize this basic truth about learning. In the book, I present a plan for making the necessary changes through policy activism and an iterated design process. Visit the website dladvocates.org to find out more. Thanks for watching.